Good afternoon. Are you all feeling refreshed? Yeah. Is it getting warmer here, or is it just that we're about to talk about election? Before I announce our next speaker, allow me to briefly remind you that tonight we will be having the big party in honor of Bruce McCormick's retirement. It will not take place here, but in a more illustrious setting. So we're going to migrate over to the atrium of our library. I assume you all know how to find it. If not, find someone with coattails to hang on to make your way there. Matthew Aragon Bruce finished his PhD in History of Doctrine here at PTS in 2014, I believe. He's working on modern European theology and medieval theology. We've already asked questions in these couple of days here about the possibility of theology without metaphysics or theology without illumination, possibly. Here we have the question of a theology without voluntarism. Matt Bruce now teaches in the Calvin Prison Initiative in Ionia, Michigan. This is a program run in partnership between Calvin University, Calvin Theological Seminary, and the Richard Hadlin Correctional Facility. So very much a Barthian kind of ministry. He's also a longtime Barth translator. And to give us some light fare this afternoon, he's gonna talk to us about Karl Barth and election. We look forward to your lecture.
I am so happy to be here. For me, it's kind of a homecoming. I did 2 degrees here, both an MDiv and a PhD. During those years, I think I helped run this conference about 8 times. So I want to give a special thanks to the students who are helping. For Chelsea, for Nicola, others, you are the one who really makes this work. I know that by experience. I also want to thank Paul and Kate for inviting me to speak. About a year ago when they did, and they asked me to speak on election, I didn't know whether to take it as a compliment or whether I drew a short straw. Let's just say Karl Barth's doctrine of election has some debates and controversies. One of my aims here is to try to reframe things and maybe dial down the heat a bit. I want to introduce into the conversation another theological and philosophical debate about freedom, which is the debate between intellectualism, that's one view, and voluntarism. I'll explain what these are in a minute. This debate has its roots probably as early back as Plato and his Euthyphro, but it really comes to a head in the late Middle Ages, and I'm going to spend some time explaining that. First, I need to make a couple qualifications. There are going to be 4. 3 of them are about Barth. 1 of them is personal. If you haven't already figured it out, I have a stutter. My students tell me that after about 2 or 3 classes, they don't even notice it. You all haven't had the privilege of having 2 or 3 classes with me, so you will notice it. I find it helps for me to tell everyone because it lowers my anxiety, and the audience actually pays attention to what I have to say rather than worrying about me. So I'm okay. I just have a stutter. I need to make 3 other qualifications on the subject matter. The first is, it may seem odd to try to solve one problem by introducing another. My argument is that Barth actually develops his account of God's agency and God's freedom in his doctrine of election by recourse of this debate from the Middle Ages. Throughout the KD, especially volumes 2.1 and 2.2, this debate pops up from about paragraph 27 to paragraph 33, which is about a 700-page piece of text. This keeps happening. He keeps talking about this debate, right? So I'm going to give you a preview. Barth rejects voluntarism, hence I'm working on a book, Theology Without Voluntarism, and he associates this view with thinkers like Duns Scotus and Occam. He defends what is intellectualism, and he oftentimes quotes Thomas Aquinas in defense of this view. So this is actually what Barth is doing, right? Second, this is my second qualification. This is a conference on Barth and Reformed theology. So why am I talking about scholastics? I just told you. This is what Barth does, right? So this is actually what Barth is doing. There's actually currently a huge debate about this amongst scholars of Reformed scholasticism, the old Protestant theology. There's all kinds of books being written on it. I originally intended to sort of introduce Barth into this conversation, but the subject matter, the text of the Dogmatics, drove me back to the medievals, right? Barth could have done this otherwise. He could have actually used the scholastics. He didn't. He could have used Kant. He could have used idealist philosophy, right? He could have drawn on figures like Schleiermacher, who are putting voluntarists like Fichte and Schelling into conversation with anti-voluntarists like Kant and Hegel. He doesn't. He draws on this debate from the Middle Ages, right? Third, I need to make a comment on Barth's relationship to theology in the Middle Ages. He, of course, wrote a book on Anselm. He taught some classes, some seminars on Aquinas, and he does read in the Summa, especially the early part, pretty thoroughly, if somewhat haphazardly. But apart from that, there is no evidence at all that Barth read theology from the Middle Ages at all, right? I can actually point out to you where there will be all these quotations that come in order in the Dogmatics. You can find all of them on a single page in, let's say, Bavinck or Dorner. He's actually is using the theology of the 19th century. He's using historians from this era, and he's just mining quotes. So I tell you all this to say, these figures from the Middle Ages are far more nuanced than Barth gives them credit for. He's actually using them as a foil. If you really care about these figures, you can wait for my book. There'll be all kinds of things in it, like modal logic. I will save you from that here. Right. Okay. So to the subject matter. First, what are intellectualism and voluntarism? One of Barth's sources, where he actually gets sort of a orientation to this debate, is a theologian from the 19th century, Isaac Dorner. So Dorner writes a long essay on God's immutability. Barth read this essay carefully. He quotes it in volume 2:1. He very much agrees with it. And in this text, what we find is Dorner asks, and he's echoing Plato. He says, does God will the good because it's good? Or is the good good just because God wills it? Right? So this is the idea. Is there a standard of goodness that God has to agree with? Or can God just say, this is good and this isn't, right, at a whim? So the first position, is there a standard, is the intellectualist version, and Dorner says this is the view of Aquinas. The other view is the voluntarist view, and this is the view that Dorner associates with Scotus. And in Barth's text now, Aquinas and Scotus become sort of the hero and the bad guy, right? Dorner writes that both views recognize that the world is accidental to God. So God did not have to create. The difference between them, and this is again a quote, that for Thomas, this position of the world is determined by the nature of the divine substance, while for Scotus, it is determined by God's absolute freedom, that is an absolute power that proceeds groundlessly and arbitrarily. So voluntarism argues that God chooses with sort of absolute libertarian freedom that what is good, right, is good just because God tells us it's good, right? There's no standard, right? Thomas, on the other hand, right, is bound by a standard of goodness. So Thomas says God has a standard of goodness that God recognizes as good, and when God says something is good, it has to accord with that standard. Of course, it can't be something other than God. So what's the standard of goodness? It's God's own being, God's essence, right? So according to Dorner, intellectualism holds that God unnecessarily wills the good, but that means that God acts in correspondence to the goodness that God is, right? A divine action flows from and corresponds to what God knows as good, and what God knows is God's own self. This means then that God is limited and constrained to act in the way that God does, for God's being is antecedent to and determinative of God's action. This might seem to call into question God's freedom, but this view doesn't claim that God has to act, right? Creation, for example, is accidental to God. God doesn't have to create, but when God does create, his act has to correspond to the divine being, right? I mean, one way to put this is God can't act in a way that isn't good, that isn't just, that isn't loving, right? On the other side, voluntarism seeks to uphold a robust notion of divine freedom at the cost of making divine freedom and action float free of the divine essence. The problem with this is that God's actions are thus arbitrary. God is so wholly other that he is practically unknowable. Dorner explains, here I'm going to quote him, the independence of the world, its contingency, is achieved by Scotus at a high price. God is for him the absolute causality, but not self-communicating. God is a realm all by himself that has no similarity and nothing in common with our own being. God in himself is transcendent to the world. For God's absolute freedom, by which the knowledge of God is present for us, is the ground of the contingent world, and the latter does not have to be what it is, not even in respect to its ethical principles. For God has not willed the world because it is good. Rather, everything is good simply because God wills it. The good is understood as whatever corresponds to God's will. It's thus arbitrary. The moral law that God ordains for the world could have been otherwise and has no internal connection with God's nature. That's voluntarism. Intellectualism rejects this. So it says that God is not arbitrary in the way that God acts. God's will is not inscrutable. It rather defends the constancy of God's goodness. But the price of this is that God's freedom is constrained. It's limited. It's bound by God's own being. And so God can't act in a way that does not conform to God's essence, right? He has to be loving, right? So God's knowledge of his own being determines and limits the choices that God makes, the reasons for which God makes choices. Let me provide a more analytic description. So both of these theories assume that there are two faculties of an agent's mind, whether it's God or a creature. The intellect, which knows, and the will, which desires. The most basic distinction between them is evident in the names given to them, right? Intellectualism gives priority to the intellect, obviously, and voluntarism to the will, which is voluntas in Latin. So, broadly defined, intellectualism holds that the good an agent pursues is determined by a judgment of the intellect. The intellect makes a judgment about the best good to pursue in the light of an antecedent inclination or a desire. And once this judgment is made, the agent pursues this good necessarily. The key here is that there's an ultimate antecedent that is not the result of a choice. So we can explain this by appealing to Aristotle's theory that human beings could desire to be happy. We want to flourish. We don't choose this. This is just what we are by nature, right? So we human beings are finite, so we can fail to recognize what will make us happy. We can make bad choices out of ignorance, right? We can basically, sin corrupts, right? So we have all kinds of problems, right? But all of the choices that we can make are ultimately connected to a fixed feature of our being, right? We desire to be happy. This is who we are. God created us this way. Even a sin works this way. If I try to kill a rival, if I steal from someone else, I'm doing these things because I think doing them will somehow grant me happiness. I'm going to get something out of them. So everything I'm doing is ultimately driven by this pursuit of happiness, right? It's also the case that to choose a good other than what the intellect says is good, right? Ask it what it says is best, right? Is to act in a way that's arbitrary or irrational. If I clearly know a certain means will achieve what I want and I don't choose it, there's no reason for that. It's a baseless choice, right? But God, if we bring God into this, God is omniscient. He has perfect knowledge of himself. He knows his own essence, and he always knows the best means to achieve what he wants, right? So God's range of choices is limited by God's perfect knowledge, right? For voluntarism, on the other hand, the willing can float free of these judgments. While the will requires a knowledge in order to make a choice, and the source of this knowledge is the intellect, the will can overrule it. There's something indifferent and arbitrary about the will and its choices. For a voluntarist, the will is free because it is not bound by the judgments of the intellect about the bestness of some good, but can pursue a good even though it knows it's not the best. Even more significantly, at least in more radical versions of voluntarism, a rational agent is not bound by their own nature, by their own desires, right? If we really get extreme here, an agent can self-create, right? They can actually determine their own nature. What is it I'm pursuing? The extreme view of this in terms of God can be illustrated by appealing to William Ockham. Ockham held that, for example, while theft and adultery are evil today, God could change things and actually make these acts obligatory and meritorious. Right? He actually, this is a quote, he says, if someone should love God and should perform all the deeds acceptable to God, God could annihilate this person without any injustice, so that after such works, God is able to refuse eternal life to this person and give eternal punishment without injustice. So for Occam, God can do whatever God wants on a whim without any connection to some prior decision, and moreover, without any connection to God's essence. Right? God doesn't have to be loving or just. Right? Bavinck, who's another one of Barth's mediating sources, who writes this about this very quotation from Occam. He says, given this view, the will in God is completely severed from his nature and all his perfections. The divine will consists in nothing but formal arbitrariness. Creation, incarnation, atonement, good and evil, truth and untruth. All of these things could have been different from what they actually are. So God in sum is free to act justly or unjustly. God is basically free to be inconsistent. God is not bound by any standard, even his own being. Excuse me. So the original basements for the conflict between these two views concerned human moral agency. But because this debates came to include argument over the relationship of human beings as moral agents and between God as the lawgiver, the categories were soon applied to God's agency. So late medieval voluntarism placed a radical emphasis on God's freedom and on God's absolute power. In fact, voluntarism arose forcefully in the late medieval period as a response and alternative to prior intellectualist ideas of agency, particularly those developed because of the reintroduction of Aristotle. So we get pretty extreme versions of this in which agents don't have really any freedom at all by the Averroes, and we get more moderate accounts by Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas, right? But this debate was pretty intense. Thomas is actually condemned as a heretic in 1277, and then he's rehabilitated and made a saint afterwards. So what is at stake in all of this is God's external agency. Is there any necessity to God's extra Trinitarian action? Pithily stated, for the voluntarist, if God is to be God, then God must be sovereign and free in regard to any and all constraints. God can choose to be just and loving in one moment and not in another. Whereas for the intellectualist, if God is to be God, then God has to be loving and just in all of his acts, right? So God's actions are determined by God's being. God is essentially limited and constrained, right? The way that both Thomas and Barth put this is God's essence is God's existence. They correspond. So God's existence, the concrete way that God acts, is correspondent to God's essence. Okay, now to Barth. I first want to explain Barth's language that God's being is a decision. This concept in Barth has a technical meaning. A decision is an act of a self-determination. Now, here's my example for this. Many of us in this room have decided to serve Christ in his church. We've determined ourselves to this task, and so we chose to pursue what is needed. We have to get an education, we have to have experience so we can serve. Such a decision requires a knowledge. We have to have the knowledge first. What do we need, right? And we have to know how to go about doing this. So of course we of course have to acquire this knowledge. I will learn it externally. God doesn't have to. God always already has it. He has perfect knowledge always of himself, and he knows what he wants, right? But nonetheless, this is a decision even for God, right? And this involves self-recognition. Because God knows who God has perfect knowledge of all that he is and can do. God can perfectly self-determine, right? So in God's recognizing who God is by knowing the divine essence, God can thereby self-determine the mode of God's existence, God's being in act, right? In other words, God chooses what to do to achieve the goal he has, right? It is precisely in this manner that Barth understands this language of decision as an act of self-determination. What Barth means by all this is that God recognizes who God is, essentially, and wills to actualize this essence, right? This is what all this language means. Again, it helps to define this in relation to us and sin, right? When we as human beings sin, we're acting in a manner that is out of line with our own essence. The nature God created us to have is one that loves and obeys God. Have God as our Lord. Right? When we act contrary to that, we're actually acting discorrespondently to our essence. God does not do this. He always acts in perfect correspondence to his essence. Right? So what Barth is saying is if God's being is a decision, he means that if God were to exist and act in any other way than in correspondence with God's essence, God would not be in his concrete existence what God is essentially. But moreover, without God's knowledge and subsequently determined will, God would not even have a reason for which to act. God's decisions and choices would thus be arbitrary, because there would be no antecedent on which to base these choices. Right? He'd just be saying, I'm going to do this. I don't have a reason. Right? So it's because God recognizes who God is as God, that God is capable of acting in a way that is authentically divine. Barth does pretty much all of this, by the way, in paragraph 28, but also in the perfections. And I'll now turn to Barth's treatment of God's knowledge and will in paragraph 31. These are the perfections of the divine freedom, where he takes up God's constancy. This is Barth's term for immutability, and God's omnipotence. So what Barth does here is he rails against phenomenalism. By the way, that's Barth's term for voluntarism. He calls it phenomenalism, puts this big envelope over it, right? He states God has an intellect. He calls this God's knowledge and a will. And these are comparable, dare we say, analogically, to that of human beings. And Barth insists that such language cannot be metaphorical. If that was the case, then all of our talk about God choosing would be merely figurative. It would be just linguistic, but not real. So Barth is worried, actually, about giving primacy to one faculty over the other, because he seems to think that by giving primacy to one over the other, the result is an effective elimination of the other one. If I say the intellect has priority, then God doesn't really have a will, right? Now, there is no form of historical intellectualism or voluntarism of which I am aware that effectively eliminates one of these faculties. Barth's just wrong. I suspect that he thinks this is the case because figures like Occam and Gabriel Biel do seem to make the statement that all of this language is figurative, right? Indeed, one of the chief tasks of paragraph 29 on divine simplicity in the Dogmatics is to reject phenomenalism. Barth's just, Occam appears there as the bogeyman, right? All this talk about God is real. This is really who God is. It's not just language, right? Barth actually tells us, he says, the extreme antipode to my own view is the strict nominalistic thesis as it is represented by Eunomius and by William Occam and Gabriel Biel, according to which all individual and distinctive statements about God's being have no other value than that of purely subjective representations to which in God, who is absolute simplicity, there is no corresponding reality. I will again say Barth's interpreted these figures rather extremely, right? But they're operating here as the foil against which he wants to view his own position. So again, the enemy here is phenomenalism. Barth's doctrine of revelation essentially teaches that God who reveals to us the knowledge that God has of his own self. It's a self-revelation, right? Indeed, one of the features of voluntarism that Barth wants to repudiate is that God is unknowable in him himself, in his will entirely inscrutable to human beings. Again, Barth thinks that God gives us his own knowledge, right? We're not getting our knowledge of God, it's God's knowledge, right? Barth thus affirms that knowing and willing are distinct operations in God, each with its own distinct task. Moreover, these are precisely the tasks, the operations that are required to be a person, right? A rational agent that knows, who desires, makes decisions and choices. If God doesn't have an intellect and a will, then God is not alive. He's not personable. He's a machine who just does what he's told, right? He's programmed, right? After this, Barth will take up the theme of God's knowledge and will in relation to God's omnipotence. So according to Barth, God knows what is possible and, quote, what is from him and through him impossible. What actually says there are things that are impossible for God. So what are these things, right? What these things are is that God can't act in a way that doesn't correspond to his own essence. And again, this is principle of God has to sort of act according to his own attributes, right? Barth's a shorthand view of this, if he wants to sum it up in a phrase, is God is the one who loves. Right? That's Barth's sort of quick way of saying this is who God is. Who's God? God is the one who loves. So it's not possible for God to be the one who does not love. He has to love, right? Because if God doesn't act this way, he's acting in a way that's contradictory to his own essence, right? Barth will then take up the distinction between ordered power and absolute power. I'm translating all the Latin. He explicitly rejects a voluntaristic kind of divine freedom, and this is his word, he endorses the doctrine of Thomas Aquinas. So Barth defines the terms ordered power and absolute power by quoting Thomas's definition in the Summa. He says God's absolute power is understood as God's power, is understood as the power God has to do both what he wants and can do, and also what he does not want or cannot do. In turn, God's ordered power is God's actual power and therefore used and exercised in a definite order. So notice what's going on here. God's power and actions and agency are ordered. There's an order to all of this, right? Barth states that this distinction is nothing other than a paraphrase of the freedom of divine omnipotence, and it is intended to provide an answer to the question of, quote, whether God is able to do other than what God has done, end quote. And Barth says, of course God can. Of course God could have done things other than what God actually did. This has to be the case if God isn't a mechanism. God is personal. He's alive, right? So Barth thus affirms a Thomistic distinction between God's absolute power and God's ordered power. At this point, it's important to note that neither Barth or Thomas mean that God can do absolutely anything, obviously, right? For God's being and act are constrained or determined by God's essence, right? I'm going to say that phrase over and over again. So Barth sees in the theology of late medieval voluntarism a transformation. This is his language of ordered power into ordinary power and absolute power into extraordinary power. So Thomas is doing this other thing, and Occam and Scotus transform it. The latter, God's extraordinary power, is taken as God's power to interrupt the former, the ordinary use of God's power, right? This capacity of God to interrupt his ordinary power is basically how Barth understands voluntarism. This is an idea he's rejecting. He actually says it's entirely unbearable. Here's what he says. This is a long quote. The absolute divine power was understood in particular by the phenomenalists of the Middle Ages as such that extraordinary power was looped back in again to the essence of God. Indeed, in virtue of his ordered power, God was actually able to do everything he wanted to do and did do, but in virtue of his absolute power, he would also be able to act in an entirely different way, and he still can. Thus, originally and for all intents and purposes, God's power is understood by the phenomenalists such that in its use, he would have been just as free and still is to create and preserve a world ruled either according to his wisdom or equally by its opposite. Virtually by a chance, that is on the basis of an absolutely inscrutable decision, God willed and did, and thus was able to do what now stands before us as his will, action, and ability. But after and before there stands behind and above his work, and in the will, ability, and action revealed in it, also a quite wholly other ability and thus possibility of God, which manifests and reveals itself in a quite wholly other work as wholly other. Barth puts it in scare quotes. It cannot be denied that Luther and Calvin sometimes spoke of this Deus absconditus too. Barth's actually critical of both of them as sort of having elements of voluntarism, right? He then goes on to say, from the power to work miracles alongside or behind the power active in the sphere of certain regularity, there now enters in alongside or behind the actualized power of order in arbitrary power, which only accidentally corresponds to the actual work of God, right? So Barth's basically saying the phenomenalists, Luther at least, sometimes, and maybe even there's an unguarded turn of phrase in the author of the famous Bromer brief that gives into this phenomenalist understanding of God, right? So he's revising his thinking here, right? So what Barth rejects is the idea that God works in the world in an ordinary way, and yet is also able to act contrary to this ordinary way, right? Again, this doesn't mean that God has to do some particular action, right? What it does mean is that, for minimum, if God chooses, for example, to create Any concrete act of creation and God's continuing acts in relationship to that creation must be in accord with God's essence, right? So God could indeed have done something different, but this something different would also have to correspond to God's being and essence, right? So God has options, but they're not absolute. They're limited by God's own being, by who God is, right? So for Barth, God, prior to the act of creation, couldn't have chosen to just do anything. Again, God is bound, but he's self-bound, right? And so any choice to create, while not absolutely necessary, is absolutely bound to God's primal decision to exist in correspondence with God's essence, right? So God is not radically self-determining, right? God is self-determining insofar as God is free to act in any way that corresponds to God's essence, right? So again, I want to note when Barth says God is the one who loves in freedom, this is his way of saying that God exists and acts in correspondence to God's essence, right? Okay. So Barth rejected theological voluntarism because God's willed activity would otherwise be understood as arbitrary and consistent against such a concept of God's freedom. Barth says, and here's a kind of quote, "It is entirely correct and important to maintain with Thomas that this, but only this, capacity is most certainly to be understood as free, but to ascribe to God a capacity different from that which he has in fact revealed in his work, and which contradicts it, is to be entirely rejected." So again, the idea is God could do other things, but those actions couldn't have been inconsistent with who we know God to be because of the way that God has revealed God's self to us. Okay, so what does all of this have to do with election? In KD 2.2, Barth gives us a nice little sketch of his anti-voluntarism. It's on pages in the German 207 to 214. I'm going to summarize it. Here he teaches that God's choice to elect human beings for salvation and God's self for judgment in the person of Christ, God's decision to be God only as the God who does this, is in no way determined, ordered, or bound by anything external to God. In other words, God is not compelled or influenced by anything external to him himself when he elects to do what he does in Jesus. The reason for this divine election to be gracious towards human beings lies entirely within God, and this is not the result of some external coercion, right? So God thinks Barth is absolutely free in regard to creation, right? Why? Because creation itself is the result of God's decision. But once God creates, God is now bound to it, right? So while Barth does describe God as bound and constrained. In fact, I would argue his doctrine of election is essentially a defense of the fact that God's will and subsequent act is constrained on all sides, right? But God, of course, could only be self-constrained, right? God has reasons. These reasons are, of course, antecedent to God's actions for electing. To elect, after all, is to choose, right? To be the one who is for human beings in Jesus. So Barth actually explains this again in a reference to Thomas. He says, an artisan does not simply begin to mold arbitrarily without a plan. I don't start to make something without a plan, right? Rather, I have the plan first, and then I seek to execute the plan, right? So God's this is how God works. God's sovereignty is not capricious. It is ordered and always possessed of a particular purpose, just so it can be described, to use Barth's language, as determined. Hans Kuhn has a very good definition of this, and part of the reason why I'm going to quote Kuhn is to say this understanding of Barth is not an innovative one, it's actually the older one. So maybe our language of revisionist, and that's how it needs to be turned around. Right? So Kuhn says, God is not under the law. There is no law and no principle of order over or external to God, to which God would be bound. God is perfectly free, and yet God is not free in a phenomenalistic sense. God is not under the law. God is just as little outside of the law, but God is rather a law unto himself. And God's justice means precisely this. God is true to himself. God's justice is the correspondence of God with himself. In this manner, God is justified in justification. He is in the right. Justification is not simply a capricious, arbitrary dispensation of favor and disfavor. Rather, God is righteous precisely in his grace and gracious in his righteousness. He remains true to himself in all that he does. Right? Kuhn's description is helpful, for it describes Barth's teaching on divine freedom in a reference to traditional theories of moral agency. Barth's concept of God's pre-agency can't be categorized as determinism under the law, right, or voluntarism, unbound by any law outside of the law. Rather, God is a law unto himself, right? Barth makes statements like this. Excuse me. He says, the subject of election, this election, and thus the subject with which the Christian doctrine of election has to reckon, is above all not a God in a general, as he can be conceived and construed from the viewpoint of sovereignty, of omnipotence as a first cause. Rather, Barth goes on to say, even the supplementation of the concept of freedom by that of love is not able to change matters essentially, unless by means of both concepts the decisive thing is understood. The actual God is the one whose freedom and love is entirely foreign to abstract absoluteness, to a naked sovereignty. On the contrary, God has bound and determined himself in his freedom and in his love to be a God precisely in particular, unless not in a general. Again, this is highlighting all this language of determinism. God is determined to particular ends. So for Barth, God's freedom of a choice is concretely determined and limited by the divine being, God's being the one who loves him. Freedom. Kuhn's third category, God is a law unto himself, who not only makes the point that Barth is an intellectualist, it moreover serves to highlight the frequent refrain repeated symphonically throughout the church dogmatics of God's self-correspondence. Eberhard Jungel also highlights this theme. He says, the highest and final statement that is permissible to say about the being of God is God corresponds to himself. Barth's Dogmatics is basically a thorough exegesis of this statement, end quote. So what does self-correspondence mean? Again, it means that God consciously, purposefully is aware of the fact that he's willing that he wills to affirm that God's existence, God's being in act, corresponds to God's essence. God could not have done anything other than make this decision. Otherwise, God would not be God. Barth's use of the reflexive self draws our attention to the fact that this is the decision of a personal agent, not a mechanism, right? So God's being and act is not an emanation in some Plotinian sense, of which God is not aware. God is aware of everything. He's conscious of it. He's acting it out purposefully, right? So this reflexive language points to the fact that God is able to use his knowledge of his own being to inform every choice to act, right? So the concept of the divine being is in correspondence to the divine essence. This idea is first developed by Barth to support the doctrine that God in his self-revelation is the same as what God is in himself. And this concept makes a reappearance in the doctrine of election. God corresponds to himself insofar as God decides to be in correspondence to his essence, right? Barth describes this sort of basic decision as God's primal decision, with Dr. McCormick highlighted last night, right? So this points to a fact, and I don't see very many people making this argument, that Barth makes a technical distinction between a decision and a choice. Decision and choice are not the same thing. Election is grounded, and election is a choice. Election is grounded in God's primal decision, right? A decision is more basic than a choice. Election is ordered to an antecedent decision. So here's what Barth says. The primal decision is identical with the ground of election, not with election itself. The primal decision is the reason that God elects, right? And thus Barth says the eternal divine essence is in its determination and limitation. He goes on to say that the primal decision is the beginning of, quote, the line upon which additional decisions and choices proceed, right? So God has this primal decision. Everything else God does flows from that, right? It's a basic orientation, right? To put the matter more clearly, a decision is not actualized until it is executed. It's put into action. A decision is a punctual determination upon which choices and acts flow, right? So a decision isn't executed. It's rather an agent giving him or herself an orientation to act, right? For just this reason, the doctrine of God cannot conclude with an account of God's essence and perfection, so it can't end with volume 2:1. For the end of the story is not that God is omnipotent, just, merciful, right? But rather that God acts. God does something. What does God do? I've told you over and over again, God acts in correspondence with his own essence, right? But what does that mean? What does it look like? This is the task of volume 2:2. It describes what God does. God elects from eternity to be God for us in Jesus, right? So there's in the divine life an order of decisions and choices, right? Failure to see that God's agency is so ordered leads to the problematic view that God is free to be able to choose to do all kinds of things in such a way that they are not related to a specified antecedent and ultimately a primal determination. It is this failure to recognize that there's a determined order that leads some to conclude that God is absolutely free to be the one who loves or to not be, right? Such an understanding of God's freedom and the picture of God it depicts is, simply put, a pastoral disaster. Right? There can be no confidence that we are reconciled to God in Christ, for God's freedom entails a state of absolute unconditionedness, an attitude of indifference in regard to human beings and their salvation. This is simply not good news, right? So here's the conclusion. God is the one who loves in freedom. For Barth, the nature of God's freedom turns on its relation to God's love. The current debate among Barth scholars about election is at root a debate over the priority of freedom or love. This debate is itself a version of the intellectualist voluntarist divide. Those who emphasize freedom over love lean towards voluntarism. Those who emphasize love over freedom towards intellectualism. Barth takes a clear view on this. He always orders love before freedom, right? So Barth denies that God chooses to be the one who loves, as if God could have chosen to be otherwise. This is just who God is. God is the one who loves. God also does not create God's own being. He just is, right? Barth makes every effort to make it clear that neither divine love nor divine freedom is superior to the other. God cannot be either loving or free. Rather, God is the one who loves in freedom. But note, there's an order here. There's a taxis, right? God's love is always ordered antecedent to God's freedom. This ordering of divine love and freedom reflects the fact that the triune God essentially loves. Just so there is no abstract freedom prior to and independent of love. That God is the one who loves in freedom means that God's love is free from external constraints. God can't be prevented from being who God is, the one who loves, right? But God is determined by his own being and thus constrained by his knowledge of his being, right? So freedom can't be ordered before love, nor the will before the intellect. Barth insists on this, right? I'm going to cut some quotes for time, but he says it over and over and over again. A proper concept of God's being begins with love and articulates God's freedom by ordering it subsequent to love. To order freedom before love would effectively decouple them. God's existence and essence would thus be, quote, a result of a will, a choice God makes that could have been otherwise. God would thus be a self-creating determinative of his own essence. That God is the one who loves is not the result of a choice, but God's love is God's, and therefore it is free. God's love is pure grace. It is not owed to the creature. It's not compelled by something lovable in the creature. God's love for the creature is the overflow of the love that God already is in the triune life. God's love for another is already fulfilled in the Trinity, in the Father's love for the Son, and of the Son for the Father and the Spirit. But, and this is the much debated move Barth seems to make, this intra-Trinitarian love also already includes another who is not God. For the second person in eternity is already, by anticipation, the person of the hypostatic union. God's love for the creature precedes its existence. God already loves the creature in anticipation. And this anticipatory love is the reason why God creates. God's love is creative. It creates fellowship between God and the creature. And for there to be such fellowship, there has to be an actual creature, not just its idea. So I'm going to end with a quote from Barth. This seeking and creating a fellowship finds its crown and final confirmation in the future determination of her redeemed humanity in Jesus, in his determination for eternal redemption and vivification. What God does in all this is who he is. But what it is that he does according to his triune name, and thus in the entirety of the divine act, visible in his revelation, this is in italics, he wills to be ours and he wills that we should be his. He does not will to be God without us, and he does not will that we should be without him. But he does not will to be God for himself, nor is God to be alone. But he wills to be God for us and with us who are not God. He does not will to be anything other than what he himself also is in this relationship. His life, which is still his life in himself, which is originally and actually the one and only life, presses towards this unity with ours. He is so greatly the goodness of his own divine being that it overflows. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you for pointing us from the problem of election back to the scholastic problem that Barth is maybe trying to solve by it, and for the fast-paced ride through the positions and questions that attended. We have a little bit of time, not too much because we're at time. I see there's a lot of interest in debate. I want to especially encourage students to ask questions at this point.
Thank you so much. My name's Kate Walker, and I'm an undergraduate student in Gordon College. My question is about God's options within kind of the bounds of God's freedom as it relates to God's essence. So one could imagine that, there's not only one good or bad option for a possible world. So my question is whether or not God is bound to choose the highest good of the good options available, because just thinking through, there are several thousand years between when God walked with humanity in the garden to the incarnation to now, and there's a lot of suffering in between those times. My question is just, is this world with this timeline the best expression of God's love?
So Barth doesn't pose that question, but the logic of the view he's articulating would be, if God is sort of aware of all the options that were there, and God comes to the conclusion that best, then God has to choose that one. I think Barth doesn't want to take us to that sort of speculative place, but he does want to sort of hold open a space for God could have done other things, because he doesn't want to get trapped into thinking everything that God does, God just has to do, because again, it's this circle after circle after a circle where he repeats himself, but he's trying to affirm God is personal, God is alive, God is an agent. He just doesn't sort of act as if everything is already determined and right, it's like a machine. But the logic would be if there's a clear best, and that's what God has to do, right? Again, this is, if we look at the debates in the Middle Ages, this is part of what gets Thomas into trouble, because the volunteers are actually saying this is the logic of his view. I think there are ways to sort of qualify that, right? But there are some antinomies here.
Hi, Ed Watson, PhD student at Yale. I genuinely can't remember this. Does Barth at any point make reference to Anselm's expression of the second person of the Trinity as God's self-consciousness? And would it help him if he did, if he doesn't?
My answer to your two questions is I don't know and I don't know. It's been a very long time since I've read Barth's Anselm book. Anselm does not show up in any of this. He shows up a little bit in earlier volumes of the earlier paragraphs in 2. One where Barth is talking about revelation, but it doesn't show up in these sections where he's talking about God's essence and action.
Thank you. Cambria Kaltwasser. I teach theology at Northwestern College, Iowa. And thank you for your wonderful paper, Matt. My question is about testing your thesis in other areas of the church dogmatics. I think you've made a really clear case for Barth's rejection of voluntarism in the second volume, and I agree with you that it averts a pastoral disaster. And my question is sort of, does he avert it in other tracks of the church dogmatics? So this is a little bit of a cheap shot because I'm asking that question of consistency. So you can shoot it down if you want to, but I'm interested in places in volume 4 and his doctrine of sanctification when it comes to our agency, where he stops short of describing in a determinative way the character of the Christian life, because he doesn't want its goodness to become a possession of ours. So there are places where he suggests in his doctrine of sanctification that there are no incontrovertible marks of a good action. And what makes an action good isn't anything intrinsic to the action as such, but simply the fact that God declares it good. And that sounds to me like it might be a voluntarist God coming back in, or if not, at least that it would seem to be that way from the human perspective, since we don't have any purchase on God's judgment when it comes to our own actions.
So you've highlighted the very problem I have, which is, and I'm realizing there's several people here who have written many high-quality works on Barth's ethics, and I think Barth's ethics are a mess because of this very reason. I think he falls back on the divine command ethics and ends up with this sort of thing of this is what we do because this is God's command. And I want him to have a more robust account of we as agents, obviously with God's help, recognize the good and make decisions on that basis. I mean, this is where I've got my feet in two worlds. I want Barth on the doctrine of God and the sort of innovations he makes, but I want Aristotle and Thomas when it comes to our moral agency, and I've not found a way to resolve that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We are already over time, but maybe it is just befitting for this occasion that questions around election carry into the ensuing conversations into the evening and in other freer parts beyond the lecture hall. So would you join me in thanking Matt Bruce again for this very
I will stay here and talk.
If the speakers could just gather outside the building as last night, we'll make tracks from there.
Was I clear?